Hi, my name is Karis Rittenauer. I'm a conservation biologist with Manomet. We are a nonprofit that works throughout the Western Hemisphere to conserve shorebirds and their habitats. I wish I could be there with y'all in person today, but I'm excited to be here virtually to share with you some of the work that Manomet is doing here in Louisiana in partnership with NRCS. First, I'll introduce you to Manomet and our work. Then I'll talk briefly about Louisiana and the opportunities here for shorebird conservation. I'll tell you about the NRCS Shorebirds of Louisiana Wetlands Initiative, what it is and how it came to be, and a little about the specific conservation practices we're using to provide on-farm habitat for shorebirds. Then finally, I'll talk a little bit about our monitoring plan and the next steps for this initiative. Manomet works throughout North, Central, and South America. We conduct research and use a science-based approach to determine and protect important sites for shorebirds, as well as partnering with people, organizations, and government agencies to help manage shorebird habitat, including extensive work with producers and farmers through our Working Lands and Seas project. I'm excited to be leading the charge for Manomet in Louisiana because it is so vital for shorebirds. We host nearly 40 species annually, primarily in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and along the Gulf Coast. Not only is Louisiana a key stopover site, especially as a reliably wet region, while other states experience more frequent and prolonged droughts, we also host overwintering shorebirds, and a few species even breed here in the summer. This region is the first stop in North America for many shorebird species as they migrate north in the spring. And for many, it's their last chance to refuel in the fall before traveling over the open Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure this will be a review for some of you, but when I talk about good habitat for shorebirds, what I'm mostly talking about is open habitat with no trees and minimal vegetation, shallowly flooded anywhere from just a saturated mudflat to about 6 inches, depending on the leg length of the birds that you're trying to attract. Little disturbance and abundant food sources, primarily invertebrates. Shorebird populations are in decline, and they're considered one of the most endangered bird groups. That is especially true for shorebirds that migrate long distances, sometimes all the way from the Arctic to southern South America every year. An analysis of 19 long-distance shorebird populations showed more than a 50% decline in the last 40 years. While this initiative improves habitat for a suite of shorebird species migrating through Louisiana, I want to highlight these two species, the short-billed dowager and lesser yellowlegs. Both species have high conservation concern, according to the U.S. Shorebird Plan from 2016. These are both birds that stand to see significantly more habitat through the implementation of the on-farm practices that I'll tell you about today. While Louisiana is important for shorebirds year-round, there is a particular need for more habitat during the late summer and early fall. This is during their southbound migration from about July to November. The Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture has calculated that there is a deficit in habitat for the number of birds that migrate through, especially in that region every year. During the spring, there is a lot of shallow water, in part because of the amount of rain we get and partially due to the rice production. Usually rice fields are flooded shallowly, and until the rice gets too tall and thick, it's pretty much heaven for shorebirds. But over the summer and especially into fall, as rice fields are no longer accessible and then they're drained, there is less open wetland habitat available. The Shorebirds of Louisiana Wetlands Initiative is one of several state priorities to receive federal funding as a part of the Working Lands for Wildlife initiative. This is a national initiative within NRCS providing financial and technical assistance to producers, farmers, and landowners to create wildlife habitat on their farms without interfering with production. The Shorebirds of Louisiana Wetlands Initiative began at a shorebird habitat management workshop hosted by Manomet in Mississippi in 2015. Terry Johnston, one of the participants, was then a biologist with NRCS in Louisiana. And in partnership with LDWF, he built on the model of the Migratory Bird Habitat Initiative, or MBHI, which primarily focused on on-farm habitat for waterfowl and waterbirds following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, to create more fall habitat for shorebirds and to encourage participation within the MAV specifically. After a pilot year, the Shorebirds of Louisiana Wetlands Initiative was born as a full state priority with its own funding pool. Manomet received a partnership grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to bring me on in 2020 to increase capacity for this project. And together we finalized the way applications would be ranked and performed outreach to get the first group of landowners and producers enrolled in 2021. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of each of these 5 conservation practices. The first is what I would consider the supplemental practice. It's not going to be a very competitive application if this is the only practice you apply for, but it is very useful alongside any other practice or practices as it improves the habitat for shorebirds by knocking down vegetation, and it also provides additional financial incentive. This is just very broadly any kind of vegetation manipulation, rolling, disking, to get that veg down before the flooding period begins. For each of these practices, the price per acre is listed on the slide, just to give you an idea of what the financial assistance part of the program looks like. Next, I'll talk about the 2 practices that are very similar and I think of as the crawfish or fallow field focused practices, mainly because they wouldn't really be feasible for most row crops or rice fields. Both of these practices begin in May 1st with 8 inches at least of water on a field. Water is held on the field until July 31st for one practice or August 31st for the other. That explains the price differential, by the way. $30 per acre for July 31st, nearly $60 for August 31st. Veg manipulation, like the rolling we talked about, is applied as needed if there has been a large amount of vegetative overgrowth through the growing season. For both of these practices, the water being held on the landscape is not actually providing the habitat. Crucial shorebird habitat occurs when crawfish ponds and other deeper water is drawn down, exposing the invertebrates within the mud at the bottom. So the goal of these practices is not to provide flooded habitat from May through July, but to shift that crucial drawdown habitat from mid-May, when not very many shorebirds are present, to the end of July or the end of August during that peak of the fall migration. Slow drawdowns are best to extend the amount of time that these resources are available, but as of right now, there is no timeline built into these practices. Finally, I'll talk about the 2 practices designed with rice or other row crops in mind. Once again, it doesn't matter what was being grown in the field as long as it has a water control structure that can be closed to passively collect water. There is no pumping required for either of these practices. Once again, the difference in price can be tracked to the amount of time and the timing of putting water on the landscape. One practice begins November 1st and water is held until February 1st. This practice has been very popular through the Migratory Bird Habitat Initiative and provides a lot of valuable habitat for waterfowl. It is still helpful for shorebirds, however, it comes at the tail end of their migration period. However, 2 of the shorebird species that will still benefit from this practice include the lesser yellowlegs and the dowitcher that I singled out earlier as species of high conservation concern. The other of these 2 practices starts in September. This used to be a hard start date of September 1st, but in talking with a lot of producers as well as field staff at NRCS, what we've determined is that the majority of farmers are not confident that they will be able to get their equipment out of the field after harvest by September 1st. And many of them said that even a 14-day window within the first 2 weeks of September would make that lift a lot easier for them. So as of this year, we have changed the way that this practice works so that the start date is flexible anytime between September 1st and September 14th. And then risers must be closed and water held on the landscape until March 1st. Another thing that we have had a lot of producers have questions about is, especially in the last couple of years, we've had some pretty heavy storms in September and some even into October. And of course, producers will be able to open their water control structures. You know, we're definitely not trying to flood out anyone's fields or anything like that. So that's been something that folks have been pretty concerned about and that we've had to make explicitly clear after the last couple of years. Despite the difficulties of outreach during the COVID-19 pandemic and the awful hurricane season of 2020, we managed to receive 20 applications, each one of which was accepted and has now been signed into a contract. I mentioned earlier that there were some unavoidable delays on the federal side of NRCS this year, so these producers will start implementing these practices in 2022, by which point we hope to have several thousand additional acres enrolled. It was a pretty huge success to get over 10,000 acres enrolled in a single year. Going into this process, we had a goal of 6,000 acres over 2 years, and we blew that out of the water. I think that's a pretty good first step, and I'm looking forward to the next step in growing this initiative. All of the acres enrolled in 2021 were located in this region of the state: Vermilion, Iberia, St. Martin, and Acadia parishes. I mentioned earlier that one of the goals of this initiative was to increase enrollment within the MAV specifically, and the Delta region is one of our main priority areas for expansion in this coming year, with specifically the circled parishes as our main targets. We're also interested in expanding the Gulf Coast region further west into Calcasieu, Cameron, and Jeff Davis parishes. However, that being said, every acre counts. We're ecstatic to have over 10,000 acres committed to shorebird habitat for the next 3 years. Part of the capacity Manomet provides to this effort is monitoring the shorebird response to providing additional habitat. I plan to monitor as many fields as possible regularly once implementation begins, comparing them both to nearby fields that are not implementing these conservation practices, and, where possible, comparing the same field before, during, and potentially after the implementation period to determine the efficacy of this program going forward. Manomet has also teamed up with the Gulf Coast Joint Venture to include enrolled acres in their regular aerial habitat surveys. I hope that through involving producers and landowners in conservation practices for shorebirds, and if they're open to it, involving them in the monitoring process as well, they will be more likely to adopt these practices beyond NRCS's limited payment window of 3 years, and perhaps become more interested in and passionate about conservation and shorebirds in general. Again, thank you for your time and attention. I wish I could have been there in person, but if you have any questions or want to connect, here is my work cell phone number and my email address. I'd love to hear from any of you, and feel free to pass along my contact information to anyone you might know who would be interested in the Shorebirds of Louisiana Wetlands Initiative. Or if they're a producer or a landowner, encourage them to talk to their local NRCS office for more information.